Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to speak in this summer school. Today, I followed the previous speakers to talk about marine heat waves. Particularly, I will focus on talking about the impacts of marine heat waves on fisheries and their future projections. Global oceans through fish and fisheries are really important to human society. It provides us with a source of livelihood and economic benefit. It is very important as a source of food and nutrients for many people, particularly coastal communities who are dependent on fish and seafood for proteins and other essential micronutrients for their health. Fish and fisheries is also an inherent part of our culture. For example, in the northeast coast of the Pacific, the indigenous people have the long traditions of having fish and fisheries embedded in their traditional culture. But we know that marine ecosystems are being impacted by a variety of human activities, and that affects fish and fisheries and their sustainability. And more recently, climate change has been highlighted as a cost-cutting human-initiated drivers that are interacting with other human activities, such as overfishing and pollution, particularly exacerbating some of these impacts on marine ecosystems and fisheries. One of the elements of climate change effects on the oceans, which we are going to focus on in this section, is marine heat wave. This is a figure from the latest released IPCC report, special reports for the oceans and biosphere in the changing climate. This figure highlights the historically observed marine heat waves in the ocean. And it also highlights that these heat waves have already recorded to have major impacts on marine ecosystem and fisheries, such as the block that was mentioned and focused in the previous talk, impacting fisheries and marine ecosystems in Alaska or in British Columbia. And these impacts has been observed both anecdotally by people who are using the coast, by fishermen, as well as by scientists when they do survey in the ocean. Looking into the future with unmitigated climate change, marine heat waves is projected to further increase in frequency, duration, spatial extent, and intensity. This is again a figure coming out from the IPCC special report for the oceans and biosphere. It basically shows that with unmitigated carbon emissions following the RCP 8.5 scenario, so the red line on the left-hand side, the probability of marine heat waves is going to increase from around 10% to more than 50% by the end of the century. And that the impacts will be widespread in the global oceans, with particular impacts that are higher in the tropical oceans. However, we are just starting to get to understand what this means in terms of the increasing risk of marine heat waves on living marine resources, on fisheries, and on the people who are dependent on fisheries and these marine resources. Myself and my group try to look into these questions by using a coupled human natural systems approach. In this approach, we study the effects of changing ocean conditions, and in this case, the effects of marine heat waves on the individual level, at the organismal level, such as the effects of heat waves on the physiology, the body size, the reproduction, growth, and how that then affects the population dynamics, the distribution and abundance, and subsequently how that would then impact trophic interactions, community structure. We also look at the interactions with broader societal responses, such as fishing and the economics of fishing, and how that affects the broader changes in the society. Fish and invertebrates in the oceans prefer a certain range of temperature. And when temperature becomes too high or too low, the body functions will decrease. And at some point, the temperature can become too high for them to live and they will die. Other ocean stresses, such as decrease in oxygen, will basically makes the organisms more sensitive to temperature changes in many cases. And with changing ocean conditions, and in this particular case, the increase in ocean temperature, marine species will not stay put. Many of them can respond by changing their distribution. In this particular example, fish will live normally along a latitudinal gradient and a depth gradient. And when the ocean temperature increases, its distribution will change. And overall, in general, many species will shift to high latitude regions or deeper water, where they can find water bodies with temperature that are close to what they physiologically prefer to live in. So we build these components of the responses of fish and marine invertebrates into a modeling framework, which is called a dynamic bioclimate envelope model. It is a mechanistic spatial species distribution model that we've developed in the last decade or so. We account for the effects of changing ocean conditions, temperature, but not only temperature. We also include biogeochemistry, such as oxygen, acidity, CI, salinity, as well as some of the physical changes, such as changes in effusion currents. And we then look at the linkages to the physiological responses and how that then affects growth, reproduction, and population dynamics. We also look at how changing ocean conditions would affect the spatial distributions of the habitat and how that would then affect the carrying capacity of the habitat to support the population. And overall, this model projects the changes in distribution, abundance, and biomass of marine fishes and invertebrates populations over space and time. In the past, we applied the model to study more than 1,000 species of exploited marine fish and invertebrates around the world. The key finding is that with projected ocean warming, for example, under a high climate change scenario, RCP 8.5, we will see a large scale redistribution of marine species with high rate of invasion in the Arctic Ocean, in high latitude regions such as the Arctic Oceans, and a high rate of local extinction, particularly in the tropical area. This is an area where ocean conditions will become too hostile for species to survive, and so many of them will shift away from the tropical area, resulting in a high rate of local extinction along the tropics. However, these projections are based on the assumptions of species responding to long-term mean change in ocean conditions. We did not account for episodic shorter-term changes in ocean conditions, such as marine heat waves. So we want to study the effects of these heat waves on the fish stocks in terms of their biomass and distribution, as well as how that then affects fisheries catches and the subsequent implications for people who are dependent on the fisheries and the fish stocks. So the hypothesis is that fish will respond to the long-term mean change with decrease in biomass, increase in redshift, and decrease in potential fisheries catches. And on top of that, when we add marine heat waves, it will exacerbate this impact by further reducing the biomass, exacerbate the redshift, and decrease in catch. We recognize that there are a variety of different definitions of marine heat waves in the literature. For example, the IPCC defined the marine heat waves as a period of extreme warm surface temperature that persists for days to months and can extend up to thousands of kilometers. Our definitions of marine heat wave in this particular study is to define it by SST anomalies relative to decadal mean. And then we look at those years with the sea surface temperature anomalies that are above the 95 percentile. We know that we use the average SST as an indicator for high temperature events that occurs within a year, such as a month or days. We assume particularly that this annual average would correlate with higher frequency and duration with abnormally high temperature. And part of the reason why we have to make this assumption is because of the limitations of the fish modeling approach that we use, which it accounts for average annual changes in ocean conditions. We specifically applied this approach to study marine heat waves impacts to the Northeast Pacific region. We focus on the three large marine ecosystems, the Eastern Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska, and California current. These ecosystems are really rich in marine living resources, as shown by this map that highlights the average annual catch in the last decade from different areas of these large marine ecosystems. We take advantage of the availability of the large ensemble projections from the Earth system model to help us increase the sample size of marine heat waves in our modeling studies so that we can develop some more robust statistical analysis of analyzing how marine heat waves are impacting fish stocks and fisheries. Each of the ensemble members represent a realization of how the ocean responds to changing climate. And with multiple ensemble members. In this case, we use 10 ensemble members from the GFDL Earth system model. It provides us with 10 different replicas of how the oceans would respond to changing CO2 emissions, as well as how that then affects the emergence or the occurrence of marine heat waves in each of the realization. This figure is a schematic diagram illustrating how we combine the ensemble members to identify the marine heat waves. We start off with taking the average of the 10 ensemble members of sea surface temperature over time, and which is highlighted by the orange line on this figure. And then for each ensemble members, we calculate the anomaly relative to the ensemble mean, which is the red line. And then we identify those years at when the anomalies is above the 95 percentiles of all the anomalies. And we define that those years are the years when marine heat waves occur. For each of the ensemble members, we use our dynamic biochemical envelope models to project changes in biomass and the distribution range, including the latitude and depth range for 22 species of commercially important fish stocks in the Northeast Pacific region. To give you an example, these are three species that include in our analysis, Pacific cod, sockeye salmon, and California current. If we just focus on the sockeye salmon for now, which is in the middle column of this figure, on the top row, marine heat waves, as you expected, has temperature that are above the decadal mean. The marine heat waves are identified by the blue triangle there. The different colored dots represent different ensemble members. And when marine heat waves occur, our model shows that it impacts the fish stocks by decreasing their biomass, which is shown in the middle row. And for sockeye salmon, when marine heat waves occurred, every time it will lead to almost the double amount of the decrease in biomass relative to the decadal mean. In addition, it will also drive a further shift in distributions. For sockeye salmon is increasing the rate of upward shift of their distribution. Such trend is similar for the California anchovy, but then for Pacific cod, the trend is much more variable. One of the reasons is that for sockeye salmon and California anchovy, they are pelagic or midwater species that are more exposed to the changing surface temperature conditions. While for Pacific cod, they spend more time in deeper water, where the impacts of marine heat waves do not often reach as into the deeper waters, and thus they are not exposed as much as the other species to the effects of marine heat waves. We have similar results for all the 22 species of fish in the Northeast Pacific region, and we group them by pelagic species, groundfish, and Pacific salmon. I know this is a busy diagram. It shows a lot of information. It shows the responses of biomass, latitudinal depth range by the different roles and across different large marine ecosystems. It also highlights the intensity of the changes, as well as whether the changes are significantly different or not, different from zero or not. What are significantly different from the decadal mean or not? In general, take-home message from this figure is that pelagic species in general has much stronger response to marine heat waves. Also, the negative impacts of marine heat waves are often much more widespread across species in the south. And when we compare the responses of the biomass, latitude, and depth range of these species to marine heat waves, or just the mean conditions, we find that if we just look at the marine heat waves, the response are largely negative across the 22 species that we study in each of the ecosystem, and that the range of that impacts is often much higher compared to those occurred during the mean year. So in this case, the left-hand side of this violin pot is the marine heat waves, while the right-hand side is the mean conditions. The area of the gray zone basically represent the distribution of the species having different level of impacts or changes in the different attributes. So overall, the take-home message from this analysis is that marine heat waves are projected to add large shock on top of the effects of long-term mean climate change in the Northeast Pacific fish stocks. So overall, our studies highlight that when marine heat waves such as the block returns in the future, and particularly in the scenario where we do not have good climate mitigation, the fish stocks and the fisheries will suffer from more severe impacts relative to now. So we think that the block has had made an impact on fish stocks and fisheries. In the future, it will be more intensive and more severe, adding on top of the increasing effects of climate change. So right now, we have just completed a global analysis. So not just the Northeast Pacific, but then we expand the analysis to the global fish stocks. At the same time, we also use a new integrated assessment models to look at the consequences of the changes in biomass and fish stocks on the society through fishing, and how that affects their revenues, how that affects the jobs that are generated by the fisheries, in order to see the full range of impacts of marine heat waves on fish stocks and fisheries. So with that, I would like to thank my team as well as my collaborators, Thomas Fuliker, who is an expert on marine heat waves, for their contributions on some of the studies that are presented in this talk. I look forward to discussing with you further about this after in the discussion session. Thank you very much.